And not that there's never a time to ask, why do I feel this thing? But it's not in the moment of trying to feel it. Thinking shuts down feelings.
Welcome to the Wisdom of the Body podcast. I'm your host, Heather Grish. Here, we talk about the profound connection between mind, body, and spirit. Join me and other authors, wellness experts, and everyday individuals talk about the importance of listening to our bodies, trusting our guts, and living in deeper harmony with nature. So, whether you're seeking guidance on your wellness journey or simply looking for inspiration, you're in the right place. We're thrilled to be in the top 3% of podcasts globally. You can find the Wisdom of the Body podcast on Apple, Spotify, and most other places where people listen to podcasts. You can follow by joining my email list at heathergrish.com or by following me on Instagram at heathergrish. That's Heather, Grzych. I know you're going to love this podcast, so take a second right now to subscribe. Today I'm here with Rachel Kaplan, who is a licensed psychotherapist, a TEDx speaker, and a respected educator whose first book, Feel, Heal, and Let That Shit Go, Your Guide to Emotional Resilience and Lasting Self-Love, presents a radically new and extraordinary effective toolkit for recognizing, embracing, and processing all the feelings that life has to offer. She's a creator and host of the acclaimed podcast, The Healing Feeling Shit Show, and she's active on a variety of social media channels. She studied yoga, meditation, hands-on healing practices in India and Nepal, and she earned a master's degree in counseling psychology from the California Institute of Integral Studies. She trained in cutting-edge trauma modalities as well, such as EMDR, and she runs a thriving therapy practice based out of the San Francisco Bay Area, just around the bay, just across the bay from me. And she currently divides her time between Oakland and Joshua Tree, California. Rachel, hi.
Heather, hi.
I automatically have to make this episode explicit.
I know. I'm sorry. I love swearing. I was thinking that while you're reading my bio, and she loves to swear.
So that was very gutsy to write a book with a swear word in the title, Heal, Feel, and Let That Shit Go. I really like it. And your podcast is also great, The Healing Feeling Shit Show. Probably one of the best titles I've ever heard for a podcast.
Thank you. But I will say, when I did that, I realized it was a bit of a mistake because I couldn't advertise at all. And yet I was so attached to doing it again. And the title of my book was a big journey. I wanted to call it Emotional Potty Training for Grownups. And the wise ladies of the publishing industry, and I do think they're wise, and I also think they're stuck. They were like, honey, we don't talk about poop. And I was like, well, I do. So anyway, it was a long journey. I think the title we arrived at has the nice balance of the meaning of the book with the spice, a little bit of the spice. And people seem to tolerate the word shit when you use an asterisk. So we got there eventually. Yeah.
Okay. Well, tell me how that goes, because we have the same publisher. And there were definitely a couple of decisions that we debated that I was like not quite sure were the right decisions. They told me at one point, this was funny, that my book had too many men on it, like in terms of blurbs and things like that, because it was a fertility book. And I was like, well, wait a minute, men are involved in this process too. So, whatever. I mean, this is the thing about being an author, is that you write the book, but you have other people giving your opinion, and hopefully everybody together comes to the best decision together. Well, I like the name a lot.
Thank you. Yeah, I do too. It had worse versions in between Emotional Potty Training and this. So
yeah, I like Emotional Potty Training too. And I think it's very relatable. And especially as an Ayurvedic practitioner, there's a clear correlation also between your emotions and your digestion.
Bowels. Right.
Yeah, totally.
100%. Yeah. I think it's the clearest way to make a metaphor of feelings for sure. But yeah, of course, the second brain, I actually interviewed that author. It's very a science version, but yeah, these are connected systems. But
Totally.
Everyone, we all poop, not to like cut to the metaphor. And by the way, Emotional Potty Training is in the book, and it is the kind of lighthearted title of the modality that I'm teaching is Emotional Potty Training. So they couldn't get it out of me, but we don't have it on the cover, which I think makes sense because those men who are involved in fertility would they hold that book up on a subway? Would they hold a book up that says emotional potty training for grown-ups? Actually, that's what I wanted it to be, because it is infantilizing. It's
Yes.
funny, it's
Yeah.
direct, but it's a little insulting, which I think might
Yeah.
be my brand.
Yeah. When you say it like that, makes a lot of sense about people wanting to be a little bit more discreet about the healing work that they're doing when they're consuming content. All right. So let's talk about shit shows before we get into the content of your book. Let's define what a shit show is. And to do that, I want to know, like, who's more of a shit show,
Mhm.
Elon Musk or Kanye West, in your view?
Wow. I love that you just asked me this as if I have.
You're an
I mean, I'm
authority.
qualified on the psychological aspects, but I don't know these men too well. But let's see. What do I think? I bet Elon Musk. And the reason I'm going to say that is I think Kanye has more awareness of his situation, which doesn't mean that his situation isn't in full shit show status, but knowing you have a diagnosis, knowing that you have a pattern that creates havoc, maybe it seems like from what I've heard, and again, minimal in some way, seems like he even might know he's a narcissist or that he has like, self aggrandizing habits. And I think that awareness, while it's not enough, in fact, I'd say that's one of the pervasive problems in therapy is people have very elaborate stories of how they became how they are or why they are how they are, and the behavior isn't changed and the suffering isn't decreased. But I think probably compared to Elon, he's more in his situation, whereas I have no idea what's going on with Elon, but he doesn't seem to have any kind of accurate self-perception, and that makes it worse, I think.
Yeah. And the dude doesn't sleep, it seems. And to me, it's like sleep affects your mental health so much. So I like that assessment. I think that's a really interesting one. And I'm curious, about you a little more too. Were you in therapy? Is that kind of how you went into this path of becoming a therapist yourself? Was that how this career path came along for you?
This career path came, I was very private as a kid. Of course, all babies are attached for the sake of dear life to their caregivers, but I was always a little empath. And so I was like, I don't know about all these people. And the first person I really wanted to be as close to as freaking possible was this first boyfriend of mine who I met at 12 and was solidly my boyfriend by like 13. And he took his life at 14, and I was 14. And I tried to stop him from doing that by saying I would take my life. And so I really went dead inside. That was well beyond what my tiny little teenage self could metabolize. And it wasn't for a couple years until I had another relationship that I realized how numb I was and how I saw, I felt empty. And I was about to launch. I was going into my junior year of high school, and I knew that I couldn't build a life over a hole. And so I went to see a therapist my family had seen. And yeah, that was the beginning of the journey. I mean, the journey started the initiation of being just annihilated as a child. But this first therapist, who is actually, she wrote the foreword of the book, and I reconnected with her a few years ago. We were a little bit in touch for years. And she let me know that my season 1 was mandated listening for her therapy clients, which was pretty amazing and deeply humbling and honoring. But she was fantastically helpful for me. And she was the person who started slowing me down, started helping me find the way back into my body where my feelings were and where my heartbreak was. So she's a huge influence. And I left her at age 18. I thought I was way more enlightened and evolved and healed than I was. It turns out it would be a 25-year journey, roughly, till I feel like I got to the place where I actually felt whole and full of self-love. And that journey spanned continents and cultures. I studied, like you, Eastern religions and yoga, a little bit of Ayurveda, hands-on healing, meditation. I went to Western psychological school, and it was actually a very other influence, a native initiated healer who was probably the biggest impact of my life in my mid 30s. But yeah, the book is really the heart of what made the difference between kind of compensating me, who was actually a fantastic therapist and looked happy, and who I think is most similar to most people. All of you listeners, it's like your life probably looks good, you're successful, maybe you have a happy family or marriage or partnership or friendship, hobbies. But I think most people have this deep down lurking sense of not enoughness or wounding. And so when I realized about a year after leaving a non-viable marriage and ending with this healer and realized, oh my God, I love myself. Like it was shocking. I don't think I ever really expected to feel so well. And I felt this profound, relentless mission feeling, which now has me way in over my head at this point with work to share what made the difference. And so that's really the heart of the book. And I will say, as far as your original question, was it therapy? I have unsuccessfully tried to work with other individual therapists since. I think this is a separate kind of interesting topic, but as a therapist, I think I'm a hard client and I don't believe all the empathic moans. And I generally have a pretty skeptical view of the health of the therapeutic industry. So that first therapist was really the only individual therapist. I've had some decent couples therapists that I would say were really instrumental in my healing. And I've had to go kind of off the beaten path to find what really worked for me. And I think I now synthesize that really beautifully. And I am a hard therapist as well, but hard because I'm so good. But anyway, that was a lot.
No, I love it. And I relate to that because I think I actually almost went to school to become a psychotherapist. And then years later ended up going to school to study Ayurveda. And I really relate to that. I have a very hard time. Like, I've never seen a therapist by myself. Like, I've been to couples therapy, but I feel like it's the most vulnerable thing to let somebody have control over my mind.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Hopefully, they don't have control. Although I do think the way that most therapists are phoning it in is that I think there's actually not enough intervention. I think, you could get through, I think a lot of therapists are just like, how do you feel? And that's a really important question, but that's not everything. And so it's funny that I'm saying they shouldn't control your mind because they shouldn't, ideally. But I think as an industry, most of the time, there's more intervention that's needed. But
Mm.
yeah, it is vulnerable. It is vulnerable.
I think even a question controls your mind in a way. Even it's like, I mean, I used to lead market research teams. And I mean, because you've had a podcast too, right? Being on both sides of it, you learn whether you're asking the question or you learn whether you're the person being asked the question,
It's
like
true. Yeah.
on both sides.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're in each other's influence.
Yeah.
It makes me very curious about the aesthetics and hygiene of your mind. You must you must keep pretty close, clean circles, I imagine.
Yeah, I'm very guarded with my mind for sure. I didn't read the news and stuff for, I don't know, 6 years. I meditated daily. This was a while ago, but I went through this period and honestly, I haven't found a therapist that I feel like I would trust
Yeah.
enough with that. And that's probably me who feels maybe I have a hard time getting vulnerable with people. I probably do. Because I actually think I think it's a power to have somebody be vulnerable with you.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, and to be in the position of authority or experthood. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're aware that there's some part that maybe doesn't wanna open much, but yeah, it should be earned. And I think, therapy is expensive, it's hard to find people with availability, there's all kinds of versions of it now that, apps and all this, but I think the client doesn't often feel empowered enough to realize the fit really matters and they don't often know what to look for. And often I'll say also, I think the best therapy doesn't always feel good all the time. The person who helped me the most in my healing was, I mean, the shit he told me, I just have to remember it's okay to swear because I already have.
Yeah, it's the cat's out of the bag.
Yeah. I am going to be on a radio show this week where the very clear instructions are no swearing. We can't even say the title. So this is going to be a journey. So I should just swear. I should get it all out here.
Beep show.
Yeah. Let's see. What the heck was I going to say? Yeah, the things that this healer would say to me in the beginning of our work together were so shameful for me. I couldn't even speak them. And he spent years really holding up a mirror so close to my face around my limits and injuries and imbalances and kind of the mechanics of the parts of me that were wounded that were so humbling. And in the beginning, I would fight him. And here's a good health based metaphor. It's like, I think in the therapeutic industry, people, they come in with all their self hatred and they're like, I'm fucked up in these ways. Sorry, let me try to reel back the F bombs. And the therapist is like helping them reframe it, oh, but it was your parents or it wasn't your fault or that's the best you could do. And that was an adaptive strategy. And that's all true. And for most people, there's so much harshness toward themselves that that's actually really useful. But the thing is it's like there is a injury in the person. And when I was struggling with the degree of directness that this healer was using to point at my injury, he said, okay, imagine you go to a doctor, you have a breast tumor. The doctor isn't going to talk to you about the breast that's healthy. So I would be like, but I don't do it all the time. But he was like, let's talk about the tumor. And it's so opposite, I think, from the way the therapeutic industry is working. And what I will say now, quite a bit of time, almost a decade out of working with that person, is I'm a naturally direct and I don't think harsh, I think warm, but can be pretty fierce. Like my clients regularly tell me what a ball buster I am and, that I'm intense. I'm definitely not what you would think of when you think of, oh, my baby, how are you? But like, I do think after working with this mentor that was so fierce that I almost took it out of balance, that there is a way that there needs to be enough safety between the therapist and the client that you can receive the reflection, and there are certain people who just can't take it in a harsh way, right? And this makes sense as far as Ayurveda, like different temperaments, different sturdiness. But I do think the job of, if you're going to pay someone, how much you're going to pay them to get them to like be in your inner world with you, ideally they're showing you blind spots that you can't see and that your friends aren't showing you. And so that act of like sitting with a blind spot or sitting with the tumor, if you will, isn't comfortable. And so I do think we talked briefly for a minute about our editor, and one of the things that happened as soon as she saw my manuscript was she cut an entire chapter that was criticizing the therapeutic industry, because she said, you can't come in swinging. These are the people you need to refer your book. So I was like, okay. At that point, I was just so happy to get a book deal. I'm like, fine. But I do think that the therapist needs to have the integrity, first of all, the skill to see the blind spot, and the courage to lose the client if it comes to that. And then the integrity to show the client something that doesn't feel good. And if none of that's happening, you're going to have maybe a gentler version of yourself. You'll feel the top layers might feel more organized. You might have a prettier story about yourself, but you're still going to be walking around full of shit. And that is not good enough for me or my people.
And I will say, I think that's exactly why I've shied away from therapists. And I guess in a sense, I've had a therapist because I had a Danta teacher who was like a tough person. Kind of sounds like a similar kind of relationship with a healer that you had, where we would have conversations and where something would be pointed out to me that I didn't want to look at. And I had to like get very uncomfortable. I remember I would wrestle with it and I wouldn't be able to sleep that night. But then the next morning I would wake up and I would say, whoa, I feel so clear right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I guess like, because we want people who can, and maybe I don't believe that a lot of people can find those spots in me or something. I don't know. So what are these spots? Like, is there a clinical term in psychotherapy or in the DSM or whatever for blind spots or wounds? Like, what are some of these clinical terms that are thrown? Do they exist?
Well, I wouldn't say there's a clinical term for blind spot. There's a lot of terms out there. What I'm really talking about, what I call it core wounds, you know, and that's not necessarily the same thing as blind spot. I think to speak to what is a blind spot in the therapeutic sense, it's kind of the maladaptive, the way I'm describing blind spot. It's a maladaptive pattern that comes from wounding, that you're maybe more in sync with, meaning the person identifies with this thing that was really an adaptation based on the wound. If you go back, and this is funny to even be talking about it because it's not so much my orientation, but in Freudian psychology, at age 7, there's a part that comes online that he calls the superego, which is the part that's the most, it's, conditioned by self-consciousness, shame, the parents. It's the part that's trying to control the unfettered life force of the id Freud called it, the mojo of the life force, kind of what would be more organic, natural, less conscious of the impact and less shame that you see in younger kids, right? Not all younger kids. It can come in earlier, shame, or at least. So a super ego or any kind of like character structure that's built around an accommodation to what I would call a core wound will create a blind spot. But I think the thing you're really interested in is like, what is at the root, maybe? Or that's what I'm interested in. I don't know. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. And so there's this word that we have in Sanskrit, which is kavaigunya. I don't know if you came across that when you were diving into the Eastern traditions. It's more of a term that's used in Ayurveda and probably Jyotish. It's basically a weak and defective space
Mm,
in the body that happens as a result of a wound or an injury or an imbalance that has
yeah.
occurred in an event.
Yeah. It's interesting, without going into detail, my mentor absolutely thinks that the emotional wounds are inherently physical and elemental and do create like imbalances in the substrate of our bodies and beings. And of course, that's what this podcast is about, right? The connection to
For
body at some
sure.
level.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Which is why I use the metaphor of shit, right? It's like, that's the one thing we were taught. Okay, when you get this signal, when you get the rumbling, cramping in your guts, there's only one way to not have it. And you go to this place where you can let this thing move through you, and then you wrap up and you go back to your day. And the word emotion, if you take off the E, which I'm sure you've done and many of your guests have done, you have motion left. Some people say energy and motion, but it means to move. And it is literally, I call it clusters of intense sensations rolling in squads. So it's like there are also these physical symptoms that ideally they would be alerting us. Ideally, they would just be moving through us. They'd come and they'd go, right? Because no one taught us, hey, when you feel an urge to explode or hit the bed or yell or shake, or you feel heavy, achy, collapsing tension in your chest that makes, salt water drip out of your eyes, it's cool, go with it. I mean, and as a parent, and I'm sure you have a lot of parent listeners, of course, it's the hardest job around, and keeping your family alive and fed while, having a roof over their head and attending to all of their emotions or allowing all their emotions is quite the project, that most of us who are grown adults right now, our parents didn't have those tools and those skills, and they didn't have that experience with their own emotions. And so almost everyone we know has been profoundly conditioned out of letting those feelings move through them, whether it was in really benign ways, like a parent saying, you're okay, shh, you're okay, or there's nothing to be afraid of. The truth is, fear is incredibly organic and natural, and you don't want to talk a child out of fear. You might want to say, and I'm not going to be a coach, I don't have children, but a more adaptive, less conditioning way would be, oh, you're afraid? You're allowed to be afraid. I'm with you. You're safe, But it's like, ideally, we would have learned that those sensations that move through our bodies, if we let them, are also signals that something needs to happen. And we would get to a place where it's appropriate and to let that thing move through our body. And the thing is emotions, and they look different depending on which one. But because we didn't get that training, and even in the best case scenario, we got a conditioning out of it, this book can't be a bumper sticker, Like, it can't just be that I say, feel your feelings, because, we've lost the access point. And so my book is really about training the how to of, well, how do you do that? How do you bring your awareness? How do you find the parts that are holding these deeper pains, first of all? And how do you bring your awareness and your attention into them and allow movement? And what does that look like? And how to understand each of the main emotions energetically, how to get really skilled with them, and then how to recover from that. So you don't just stay in your emotional muck, right? And to do that, there's like the deeper healing journey that of like to go from that core wound to a place of, balance, well-being, emotional resilience, self-love. That journey is like cleaning up in a slow way the backlog of the conditioning out of the emotions and the wounding. But then there's also like the goal is to get someone to a place where they know how to feel their feelings. So when they get the signal, just like you'd go poop and it wouldn't be a big deal, you know how to go have your feeling at the next appropriate moment, recover from it, and keep going. So it's like you have this really resilient. My favorite saying I came up with in this whole journey is emotional resilience is the new happy. It's like it's better than happy because, sure, first of all, if you're really emotionally resilient, you're going to be happy a lot because the degree of healing that has to happen, the degree of sitting with discomfort and learning how to work with those feelings that has to happen to be emotionally resilient will lead to a really profound lightness, right? You'll be happy a lot, but you'll know that you can handle life because you're not only going to be happy. Like people don't graduate when they stop having hard feelings. You're going to have hard feelings sometimes till you die and probably then some, you know? But it's just like you know what to do. You know how to move it. And so therefore you can live the life that's right for you. You can actually be yourself, take risks, etc.
I love that. I always tell people my grandma's in her early 90s, and I'm like, I don't know that being happy is the thing that makes you win, like the
Mm.
race of life or live the longest or whatever. Because when I look at my grandma, I'm thinking, okay, well, she's doesn't seem like the happiest person I know, but she seems like such a survivor, you know. And I think when you
Hmm.
talk about earlier, when you talked about emotional resilience, I love that. Would you say emotional resilience is the new happy? Is that
Yeah.
what it is?
Uh-huh.
Something like
100%.
that?
Yep.
Yeah. I think that's really great. So, yeah, and
Yeah,
you have to be
having the
bold.
skills to be alive. It's painful to be alive, you know, and in ways right now that weren't there when your grandmother was our age, you know, but it's always been painful. Like everyone dies. You know, it's like win or not, you're still going to die and everyone you love will die and there's disease and loss, even just like relationships and jobs, you know. And so we have to be able to how do we handle the sensitivity of being wired to feel everything, you know, whether it's sensing the world and loud music, traffic, heartbreak, you know, it's like there's a sturdiness that comes that makes it easier to be a person.
Totally. And it's like if you start to block out those bad things, do you find that people also lose the appreciation of the beauty too? Do those come together?
Absolutely, because we don't get to selectively numb ourselves. I mean, what you'll see, so a lot of actually there's clients woven into my podcast and there's client just like describing their version of the healing journey in my book too, and a lot of them spoke to that you lose the happy feelings too, and so as you learn to feel the hard, painful feelings, you get more joy, more gratitude. I think what you see sometimes, one of the most natural strategies to avoid pain is to try to swing like a pendulum to the opposite side. So people who don't want to feel, let's say, loss or grief, which, you know, that is the cost of having a human heart, is you're going to feel grief sometimes. If you love, you will sometimes feel sadness and grief. It's natural. It's beautiful. It's a cost of loving. But if they want to avoid that, the kind of polar opposite is the saccharine bliss experience, right? And so a lot of people you see swinging into extreme addiction, and it could be anything. It could be drugs and alcohol. I call it the drug of choice. Could be Burning Man and concerts. It could be relentless buying or success or just unending busyness. But it's like generally when we want to avoid the pain, we're going to swing into the extreme, kind of trying to cleave to the top of the mountain experience, which of course is not sustainable. You crash, you come down, you're in more pain then. And actually, the goal of my work, and there's a chapter about this, about happiness and neutrals, emotional neutrals, is actually, and this is something I got from this mentor. This would not have been, I was 100%, you know, one concert to the next, busy always. But it's like experiencing that juicy midpoint of, you know, halfway between, let's say, despair and bliss is contentment. You know, it's like the robust stability and pleasantness of being balanced in the middle, where you're kind of at a zero on a number line of -10 to +10. And so a contentment that enables you to really enjoy your coffee or a flower or a sunset or sit quietly in your house without needing to touch your phone. You know, it's like that's really where you can get to. And then you're going to have the ups and downs, whether because, you know, just the fluctuations of the day. Something good happens, you feel a little more excited, you feel a little more alive. And by the way, all of the emotions, it's not just bliss and sadness that you could understand in this kind of number line way. But life is going to bring us up and down. And in big positive moments, it's going to bring us way up, and we need to learn how to come down well. And there will be a coming down. But in general, if we have a centered baseline to go on that ride from, it's a lot more enjoyable, stable, less of a roller coaster, less dysfunction, less harm that we're creating in our lives. To avoid your pain long term, there's no way that it doesn't create illness, both in the body, disease, but also relationally, in your pocketbook. Like, you're going to have to invest in some addiction so intensely to avoid yourself. There's no peace there. And that's where most people are, when they come to this healing, is they're doing a lot of something, usually trying to not just feel bad. So the hard part is getting people on board, but once you actually learn, oh, you mean I can turn toward this feeling, get to a place where I might cry, or I might hit my bed, or I might shake because I'm scared, or feel how ashamed I am for a few minutes and recover from it. You mean I can do that and feel a little bit better? It's like I can feel bad. Feeling as bad as I feel makes me feel better. It's like, it's amazing. Like, and it's not simple because we still have to do this whole untangling, someone doing it without a therapist, without a skilled therapist. They're still going to have to learn, how do I actually do that? But it's so much simpler and there's so much more permission, and it actually works, whereas the other game, like, no matter how you do it, you're going to lose. There's just more suffering. So if the whole point of doing that is to avoid suffering, it's not the best way to avoid suffering.
Right. Because what I'm hearing is that there are a lot of people essentially experiencing, whether it's an emotional roller coaster or some sort of, I don't want to call it a mental imbalance. I hate saying that. Some sort of issue, mental issue, possibly a physical issue, because they're emotionally suppressing, because they're avoiding things that need to be addressed and felt, and pushing it aside and moving on with life. So, what do you recommend? So, for people who are very busy, right? Like, so people who experience things that are difficult, who are very busy, and they have to like get through their day. They can't feel those things because they got to do their stuff. They got to go to their job. They're a doctor. They got to see their patients. How do you recommend? Is that why having the space on the calendar for therapy is important? Like, what other things do you recommend people?
Yeah, well, it's not always the appropriate place to poop, right? Like, if one of us had to poop during this call, we wouldn't just do it right now, Similarly, it's not always the moment to have your full feeling session or feeling release. And so it is about creating some structure around that. I feel inclined, and I do want to give some practical tips, but I just want to go back one step. I'm in a coaching process right now around this TEDx talk that's coming up. And I know that, I can be kind of abstract. And I just want to offer a few little examples of the last thing, and then I'll come back into these like
Mm,
structured
yeah.
tools. But like, because weave one other concept back in. The deal is that almost everyone has a core wound. It's not just like only the messed up people or only the people who had huge traumatic events. Like, and so there are so many strategies, like we talked about the blind spots, the strategies, maladaptive strategies. Someone could have, here's an example. Someone could have a strategy where if they just please everyone around them and they're overgiving, they're not having any needs, they're like, giving their cookies away and everybody likes them, that maybe they'll be okay. That might be how they're trying to avoid their strategy or their pain, their core wound. And the spoiler is that the core wound for most people, almost everybody, is some version of I'm not enough, I'm not lovable, there's something wrong with me. It's some version of a felt sense that's way deeper than our intellects. We had that feeling before we learned words and thinking. And the reason we had that feeling, just to make it really clear, is like we were raised by humans who had their own limitations. And we are little animals that are wired to know that if we don't get cared for, we'll die. And therefore, if every time we cry a lot or every time we express ourselves in a certain way, mom glasses over or dad says don't walk like that or someone gets upset, we are biologically wired to push those parts of us out of our expression, to be less authentic, is how Gabor Mate talks about it. The battle between attachment, security, and authenticity. It's like you try to not be that way. You push that part of you into repression, into an emotional basement. And that part, anything you would sequester alone into a basement is going to start to feel like a real problem. It's going to feel like a shameful secret. And, it's not just our parents and families that condition us eventually. You go to school, you've got the conditioning of the other kids, the teachers. Now people have social media, we have our culture, and we're living in an economy that's literally telling us we should be this way, but not this way. So most people have these aspects that they're trying to contain and that they fear if they express, whether on a date or at a meeting, will make them lose love.
Is it literally the stuff that's like your parents kind of said, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that? Is that kind of what you see
Often,
most of? I'm observing myself as a parent now and I'm like, how am I screwing my kid up? Like, I just
well,
keep asking.
first of all, it's just like, be gentle with yourself. I bet you're doing the best job that's ever happened in your lineage. I think that's true. But I think
I
it's
had
just a
an
human
awesome
thing.
mom. I had a
Oh, you
really great
did?
mom. Yeah.
Well, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank
That
you.
might be why you're so lovely.
Oh,
I think what it is it's like it's a little less specific. Like I don't do much encouraging of people to think on their healing path, which might sound like I want to create a cult. My boyfriend's like, you'd be a great cult leader, but I don't. But it's more like our thoughts are not so helpful. Like for instance, if just a real quick tip, if every time you have a feeling, you're like, why am I feeling that? You're subtly telling yourself you shouldn't be feeling it. And you're trying to pull out of the system that's actually having the movement into thinking, which is more comfortable for most of us, despite how it actually makes us feel. But anyway, and not that there's never a time to ask, why do I feel this thing? But it's not in the moment of trying to feel it. Thinking shuts down feelings, right? So, the one place I really think thinking can be helpful is if you reflect on your childhood, maybe compare yourself to your siblings. Like, did you think that what made someone a good person, like for instance, my sister and I was probably like a little bit better on the like, school grades and sports front. And she was a lot more connected to my family and had an easier time making friends. I've always been bossy. Now I have a place for it. When I was little, the kids were like, she's bossy, which I think is great. But, I kind of felt like, well, what makes someone a good person is that they're really connected. They're like some kid version of that understanding. Being close makes you good. And I was actually shamed, in my family for being so disconnected, for keeping myself distant. Remember, I said I was a little sensitive empath that was like, I don't know about you guys, right? That was actually told to me, I was actually called a bitch at some point as a little child. It's like, so I thought that part of me made me bad. And I can see that based on how I compared myself to my sister. I also had a very early experience of sensuality in my body. And I think I used it to self-soothe. So I thought that made me bad. So it's much more, I encourage everyone to lose your big words when you're trying to think of what is wrong with you. It's like, what is that gnawing sense of what's inadequate? Do you think you're not smart enough? Do you think you're too emotional or too sensitive? It's like there was some conditioning that happened incredibly early. And it might be that you were, in a lot of families, the parents aren't stable enough to center the kid's experience. And so the kid is actually using their early development to figure out, what do I need to do for this other person so they're okay and I can be okay. And just in case it's interesting to you, the reason why we all think there's something wrong with us versus like, oh man, my parents not great, is that to realize that the people taking care of you are also causing you harm brings out helplessness and dependence. Like that's a painful thing for a child to realize, is like you're innocent, but you're helpless. And so for most people, the illusion of control, well, I'm bad, but I can try harder. Maybe if I clean my room, maybe if I talk the way dad wants me to talk, if I don't cry. It actually was more adaptive for us to think it was our fault. That was brilliant back then, right? And so everyone has some aspect. I mean, almost. Whenever I meet someone who doesn't seem to, I'm like, what is this, And so the strategies like you described when you said mental imbalance, just to bring it back to where we were, mental imbalance, emotional roller coaster, those are just, it's hard to have a life that fits you where you feel like yourself and where your most intuitive, sensitive parts that would ideally be telling you this is for me, this isn't for me. Those are the parts that get locked in the basement. It's not like our strengths, we end up overcompensating with our strengths for the parts that are maybe more sensitive, more nuanced, and ultimately what make us cool, right? Like the ways we're different are actually what's most interesting if we can get them back online and help them feel worth being expressed, right? But so people's lives don't fit that well when they have these parts in the basement, and people live in fear and people live in overcompensation mostly. And there's a myriad of ways, infinite ways to do that, whether it's Netflix or pornography or shopping or busyness. So now we're back to your question of like a busy person. Here's a person who's compensating through busyness. They have a big life. And, it's real. Like I have like 6 jobs right now. I'm busy as hell, and at this point, my system is pretty regular. Like I just cry when I need to. Like I could be doing a lot more. The amount of pressure and stress on me has me occasionally acting in ways that I think are harsher than I would like to be honest, just because I'm so at my max trying to meet, I have a retreat and this thing, like the moment of the book coming out, it's an intense one. And so like, I'm not saying I'm in perfect form, and it's showing me a kind of in some way my upper limit of how much I can hold and still be well. But I am so well, like my partner said, God, if most people had one of the strands you're holding, they'd break down. And it's like all these strands. So there's a real demand to live in the world, to live in an expensive area, to raise children and work, to have jobs, to follow a passion. You are busy. Everyone is busy. So there's like 2 components of this practice. I mean, what I've been speaking to around the wounding and finding the parts that are hurting, that's like the first component. I say wings, that they're wings. And the reason I say that is that you need 2 wings to fly if you're a bird. So both of these pieces need to be functioning to have health. The first wing is parts work. It's parts reintegration work. And it's like, how do you figure out who you've cast out? And how do you start a relationship with them where you bring them back online? And that's something that happens slowly. It happens through reflection. It happens through pulling out photos of yourself as a kid. It happens through once you have a sense of who those parts of you are, it happens through a lot of regular check-ins with those parts and reparenting. And that's something that's going to be spread throughout your day. So the busy person who wakes up but is also checking on their little Maggie, let's say, little Rachie, maybe it's that they have an alert on their phone, or they have a practice of in the morning, checking in with that part. How's that part feeling today? Is that part feeling like it needs more maybe internal time, or is it feeling emotionally balanced? Is it feeling upset? That person would be tracking who in their life is safe for the little part, right? And that's something that you're going to do kind of intermittently, and it will add a step to your work, and it might really derail the busyness because your part, if you really listen to it and start to honor it, might say, I know you have 3 parties to go to and I need a bath and I don't want to see anyone. And so if someone's going to get really good at this, they're going to have to battle that out to learn how to actually honor the needs of the parts they're reintegrating. If you find the part and invite it back and then treat it like shit, you're still just abusing it the way that it was abused by your original family and culture, but usually by us. We're the ones who keep those parts locked in the basement for so long. So if you're going to go on this path, you have to be willing to really try to take care of the parts once you bring them back online. The bigger question I think you have is about the second wing of EPT, or emotional potty training, which is emotional release work. And that is, this practice of learning to and having the feelings move through the bodies. And there's 2 versions of that. There's a reactive version and there's a proactive version. The reactive version is something hard happens to you. Like, let's say you're about to go into a meeting, you have a fight with your partner, you want to cry, you feel agitated, you want to scream, you want to cry, something like that. The calling it a practice, even though it's reactive, something happened to you. You're a tube of toothpaste, you got squeezed, feelings are coming out, right? The practice part of it would be learning what is appropriate. I hate that word, but it's appropriate to use the word appropriate. What's a safe, healthy way to let that feeling move? It's not by spewing venom at your partner. It might not be crying during the meeting. That's not, is it the end of the world? No. Let's live in a world
I've
where
done
if you
that.
cried,
I've cried in a
yeah,
meeting with my old
absolutely.
CEO. That was the best
Yeah,
meeting I ever had, actually.
exactly. Yeah. Like, hopefully that's the world we're going to. But it might be like, okay, I have 2 minutes. I'm going to go beat my bed instead of yell at or say something unkind. I'm going to like have it out and learning how to come out of it well. And there's many chapters on how do you do the steps of moving your awareness into the pain, out of the pain. This is all deeply, thoroughly, slowly covered in the book. So no one get worried that like, wait, I can't keep up with what this fucking
Yeah.
woman is saying. But excuse me, I did another F-bomb. Anyway, but it's basically like, how do you learn to have your feelings on the fly when life is hard? That's the reactive version. And then the stuff that really heals you and that busy person is really going to have to grapple to create in their lives if they want the opportunity to get off the hamster wheel is, how do I build in, just like you would go to the gym or do your meditation or go to yoga, how do I build in a container to turn toward myself, to slow down, to get curious, to have the sensations of the emotional pain that is in my body come up? How do I learn the skills of how to bring those up? And then how do I find some very practical in the world mechanisms to move it? Like, anger and sadness are opposite energetics. They need a very different kind of container to move. Like you could be caffeinated and do anger work. If you're sped up, you're probably not going to feel sad. And if you had a big double espresso and then you tried to slow down and be
Yeah.
sad, good
You can't
luck.
drop. Yeah, you can't drop.
I think this is a good way where it goes into Ayurveda and like these like, very brilliant systems where there's no separation, where mind and thoughts and feelings and bodies are all one thing. Anger is an explosion. At the end of the day, these are energetics. It's like up and out. Sadness is a down, it's a heavy collapse, right? And so for sadness and a version of fear, for the freeze or the paralyzed version of fear, and for some aspects of shame of like, oh my God, I'm the worst, it's really about swaddling. It's about creating containment and slowing down and allowing that heavy downward ache to emerge. And you might use sad music, and you might get under a weighted blanket. You might lay, with a tree that makes you feel held. And then there's frenetic fear, like fight or flight fear. And there's rage for sure. And there's actually a certain amount of very active fighting back work that happens with shame. That's really when you're like at the center of the onion, the root of the wound, where you have to fight for the experience of feeling like you're good enough, that uses much more active, like frenetic, shaking, hitting, where you're actually trying to meet that energy or channel the resistance that anger has in physical ways. And so if someone wants to heal, they're going to need to build in a few of these windows in their week. Let's say 3 would be a really good goal in the beginning. Maybe 30 to 40 minutes, 20 would be great, right? That's where it's hard. It's like I resisted it, my clients resist it, because we don't want to, especially on a good day, because you don't just do this on the days when you feel bad. I mean, because then it's reactive, right? This is about if you want to get your core wounded baseline from being in the shitter to neutral, you have to like build it in. Just like if you want a 6-pack or you want a thriving business, you have to work on it. Like, and so usually people, especially people who are very sped up or very medicated on substances or whatever it is, their maladaptive approach, like it takes the most work to get them to try this and to be successful with it. Because at first you're kind of fumbling. But once people taste the relief that is possible when you just had your hard feelings for 2 to 5 minutes, let's say, I know I said 30 to 40 minute, you're lucky to stay with those feelings for minutes. People are so afraid, well, if I start crying, I'll never stop. I'm like, I'll pay you $100 if you can cry for 5 minutes, short of like you just were dumped, divorced, or your best friend died or something. So, once you taste the relief of, oh my God, and I spoke to this earlier, letting myself feel that, I feel so much better, kind of how you felt the morning after you got confronted, that clarity and lightness and peace that comes from being able to be in your body, not hiding from this pain. And you have gotten that emotional dump lighter now. You don't have that little like square inch of emotional pain in you, which doesn't mean that it's like, there is some degree of clearing out a backlog. And, my mom once said to me actually about yoga when I was doing a lot more asana than I do now, she said, oh, you do yoga all the time. You must be getting so good. I'm like, Mom, you're showering a lot. Are you getting so clean? It's like, it's a process. Like the goal is to get to a place where you're just current but you can feel. But there is a degree of like lightening a massive, think of decades of not pooping. It's like that's what most people are like. It's decades of not really feeling. And so once someone is on board, once they have that taste, it's generally people will make the space. But what I really try to do for the busy person is say, try to get them to create a few of these sessions, try to really talk up the relief that's possible and really help them realize the pain they're in because it's not working. None of those other things work. And so it's like if someone's sober enough to be able to see that, it's usually as soon as they taste the relief, they're motivated. But it's hard work, and it's slow work. It can be. Hopefully my book will make it faster.
Yeah. I mean, nobody wants to feel pain. And it's part of the, like you said earlier, part of the game of being human. And
Right.
we covered a lot today. Thank you
We sure did.
so much. All right. One last question. What does the wisdom of the body mean to you?
It's the only wisdom that matters. I used to want to transcend and be enlightened. Now I'm just like really trying to be in my vessel and trust the direction that's there and accept the limitation that's there so that my unique self and my little wisdom body can thrive.
Awesome. Thanks so much for being here with us today, Rachel, and tell everybody how to get in touch with you.
Pretty easy, thefeelingsmovement.com. And that is both a movement, it's a revolution. Let's have our feelings. And it's also like a bowel movement. Thefeelingsmovement.com. And I do retreats and I have a lot of like courses that, kind of take this, that my book's there. Eventually the TEDx will be there. Anything about me you can find there.
Sounds like we need to do a cleanse retreat together.
That would be so fun. In the desert, maybe?
Yeah. Awesome. I've loved chatting with you. Been fun,
So fun.
and also meaningful and deep. And thanks so much for sharing so much today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. If you are embarking on a fertility journey and are ready to have your mind blown about what your body is really capable of and how it's impacted by the environment, then check out my book, The Ayurvedic Guide to Fertility. You can actually download the introduction to the book for free on my website at heathergrish.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. Read the intro for free and then buy the rest of this fertility enlightening book pretty much anywhere books are sold. You want a full human experience when you seek a healthcare provider, and you don't want 15 minutes with someone who can't even try to find out the root cause of things because they're so overwhelmed themselves. You have a body, a mind, a heart, and dare I say it, even emotions. You're not crazy. Everything does affect you, and it's possible to feel better if you have the support you need. Set up an appointment with me to heal naturally. Go to heathergrish.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. Thank you for tuning in and dropping in with us today. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. I really want to hear your feedback. To learn more about my work, visit heathergrish.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. And meet me here next time on The Wisdom of the Body.